Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Cinema 4D Fundamentals. Today is about camera animation inside of Cinema 4D. I hope you do well. I think a lot of you have a lot of time now to watch tutorial, which is great. I have more time to do some tutorials. So yeah, let's get started. And what we'll cover today is to do camera animations. If you saw the last tutorial about the display land photogrammetry thing, where we also did this kind of camera animation, moving the camera from left to right, up and down. This is something you can of course do in Cinema 4D and where camera animation comes into play. I have another example. So imagine you have this kind of product shot, this car in center, and you want to do some smooth camera animation, but you also want to do the cuts in between. You can easily do that in post. You can just render different camera animations, put that together in post in After Effects or Adobe Premiere or DaVinci Resolve or whatever. But you can actually also use tools inside of Cinema 4D to do that cuts between different cameras. So what we cover today is the basics of camera animations, about the camera object, how to set up Cinema 4D to render multiple frames. And we'll have a look at the stage object and the camera morph object. And I think this will cover the most important things about camera animations inside of Cinema 4D. So yeah, without further ado, let's go ahead and go inside Cinema 4D. The first thing I like to cover is the timeline down here. So this is the basic timeline in Cinema 4D, which we'll use to do some animation in our scene. Now there's also a more advanced timeline, which you'll find under Window, and then you can go to the timeline dope sheet or timeline F curve. This is some kind of like an advanced manager of your animation, but for now we will just keep to the simple timeline down here. So what you can do here is you can set the frame range you want to do or to have in your editor. So let's say we want to do a animation which is 90 frames long. I can type that in, 90 frames. And this slider, this is the preview range. So let's say we have an animation which is 90 frames long, but I only want to preview the first 60 frames of it. I can use this slider to adjust the preview range. Now the next thing which we should check is the project settings. So when you go to the project settings, you will find that if you open a new scene, or if you go to edit, project settings, and you can also use the shortcut Command D to open that up, or Control D on Windows. And what you find here under FPS, which is for frames per second, this is the amount of frames per second this whole project is based on. So I think by default it should be at 30 frames per second. And you see, as soon as I switch that, we have this switch also in our preview timeline down here. So if I have an animation which is 90 frames long and I have 60 frames per second, then that's what we got here. Now if I use only half of the frames per second, let's say 30 frames, you will see we also divide that by 2 down here, and we only have 45 frames of animation left. Now if you do animation, the amount or the frames per second do matter a lot. So first of all, if you do animation, and you should set the amount of frames per second you want to do your animation on and set that up here in your project settings before you start. By default, just go with 30, that's fine. If you want to do something super smooth, you should go up maybe to 50 or 60. And if you want to do something which looks a bit more cinematic, then you can actually lower it a bit to go to 24, 25 frames per second. Now, the thing is that the more frames per second you have, the longer the render times will be, because each frame of your project, of your scene, has to be rendered by Cinema or your render engine of choice. So just keep in mind, if you do 60 frames per second instead of 30 frames per second, your render times will actually double, because you have to render twice as much images for your animation. Now, speaking of rendering and frames, I go to the render settings here and have a look at the output settings. You will see we have another setting here for frame rate. So don't mix that up. We have the frames per second, which is for our project, and we have the frame rate right here, and that is the frame rate the render engine will use to output the animation. So if I set that to 60, you will see this will not change here. And what you can do here in the lower part of this window is you can set the frame rate which you want to render. So let's say I go to all frames, Then it will render all the frames set up down here in this preview timeline. And as you can see now, we have 60 frames set up here in our project, but we only want to render in 30 frames per second. You would see the resulting frames you render will be from 0 to 45, which will result in 46 frames. If I go to the frame rate, type in 60 frames per second, then you will see we'll actually have the 90 frames, so the full frame range. Okay, the other thing you can do here is you can set this to current frame. This will just render run frame. This is good for testing some stills in your animation. Maybe you want to pick a certain position in time and you want to test render this. So this is good when you use the current frame. You can go to all frames, recover the just, and we can go to preview range. This is also just use this, what we have here in the preview range. So let's say our animation will be 240 frames, but we just want to render the preview range. So I can just adjust my preview range maybe to 90 frames, and then the preview range will just render those frames. And last but not least, we can also go to manual and say, okay, I want to render from, let's say, frame 15 to frame 120. This is what the manual thing will do. And down here, you always find the amount of frames the render engine will use. Now if we hit render, make sure you have set up the right resolution for your rendering. Now if I go to render, you will see, of course, I haven't set up a file where all the frames will be saved. That's fine for now, and the scene is just black, but what you see is now that we will render all the frames here, and this is how basically animations will be rendered frame by frame. Okay, enough about the settings. Just make sure that we go back to 30 frames per second in the project settings here, and we have a look at the render settings again. We also make sure that it's at 30 frames per second, and we set the frame range to all frames. And for preview renderings, we just stick with a low resolution here just to keep it quick and fast. Okay, let's have a look at the camera. The camera object you find on top here in the top menu, and if you click that button, you will have the camera inside your object manager. Now if I move my camera in the editor out a bit, you can see we have the camera also as an object in our scene, which is nice, good reference to see where our camera is at. And now if I want to move the camera around, I could use the axis handles here to move the camera around, but it's actually a bit of tedious way to do it. So the best way to do this is actually to go inside the camera and then move the camera around. So how do you do that? We go inside the camera by hitting that little button here. This looks like a bit like an autofocus or focus symbol you find in the viewport of your camera. And yeah, as soon as we hit that, we're inside the camera, and then we can move around, zoom, rotate the camera, whatever we want to do to adjust the position of the camera. Now, if I hit that button again, I'm back to my default camera. You will also see that on top here on the menu. Now, if you click on that, you can also just switch to different cameras in your scene. So let's say we have another camera here, which is camera 1, and another one, which is camera 2. You can always use this quick menu on the top here to switch between different cameras. Let's actually move around a little bit so that we see that. Now, if I go to camera, you see this camera, camera 1, and then we have the default camera. The default camera is always there. You can't delete this. This is just like, yeah, the default camera. And as soon as you add other cameras to your scene, this will show up right here in your menu. Okay, sometimes, let me go back here and delete those cameras. So we have a new camera set up here in our scene. Let's add an object to our scene to make it a little bit more interesting. There we go. And let's say we are inside this camera and we positioned our camera right at the spot where we want it to be. Perfect. Okay, now I want to check something else out in my scene. Maybe there's a cube which is over there. So I move my camera and then move around, and then I want to go back to my camera, and then I think, oh shit, I'm still in that camera, so I move the position of my camera. Okay, that's not too bad. There's a shortcut you can use to go back in the camera positions. It's Command Shift and Z or Control Shift and Z in Windows, and hit that multiple times, and you will go back multiple steps in your camera settings. So this is not the undo button or the undo function. It's like the camera position undo. So the normal undo would be Command Z, and this Command Shift Z is the undo my camera position. So that's very useful. And let's say we want to protect our camera. We want to fix the position of the camera in order to not by accident do something with it like I did before. What you can do, you can go to do a right click on the camera, go to rigging and use the protection tag. Now this camera will be protected, and when I try to move around, zoom out, zoom in, whatever, then this will be protected by that tag. So now if I go out to the camera, you can see this is faded out a little bit, so I can't move it anymore. Now that's actually not so important for camera animation, because we don't want to protect our camera when we want to do animation. But in general, if you're using cameras and you want to protect the position of your camera to fix it, then this is the way to go with the protection tag. Okay, let's have a look at the camera object itself. There are a lot of settings. We just want to focus on the object settings for now. And in here, there are basically just one or two important things to set up. So the first one is the focal length. And I highly advise to look up a bit about photography if you want to work with the camera inside of Cinema 4D, and to know how a physical camera works. It's actually quite helpful to deal with those settings. To cover the basics, the fundamentals, keep in mind or just understand that the focal length defines basically the field of view of your camera. You know it from your camera. Maybe you have different lenses you can put on your camera. Maybe you have a small lens which is like a super fisheye kind of thing. Let me go in the camera here so you see that. So we have actually a wide angle of field of view here. So we see a lot of things in our scene. That's now a 15mm lens. And if I go to something like a portrait lens or even the Taylor lens, which is like a zoom lens, you see we zoom right into this object. And if I go out of the camera, you actually see by this shape of the camera here that if I decrease the focal length, you see how the field of view gets bigger or more narrow depending on which focal length I choose. Now the settings here are actually quite useful. So let's say we want to use something which represents the field of view of a human eye. We would go to the normal lens. This is a typical lens for like a default camera you carry around in everyday life. But if you want to do something different, something special, you could use a wide angle camera, or you could use a Taylor or whatever lens you want to pick. Now the sensor size will also define the field of view of your camera. For now, just keep that at 36mm. This is also basically the default in most of the cameras, or let's call it full frame cameras. So if you have like a compact camera or you use your smartphone to take photos, the sensor size will definitely be something else. But if you use like a movie camera or something more of a high quality DSLR camera, then you will probably have a sensor size which is close to 36 or even 36mm. Now you can also define the field of view to something specific here. Let's say we want to have a field of view of 60 degrees, then the focal length will be adjusted accordingly. Yeah, that's actually for now the only thing you need to know. Maybe just one thing is the thing you can do here in your viewport with this handle is to adjust the focal distance. Now, if you just do a standard rendering and you don't use a physical rendering, or you don't want to have depth of field in your scene, then the focal distance actually doesn't matter. So this is only important if you want to do some more advanced stuff. We will cover that later. But for now, just ignore that value. Not so important if you do your first camera animations. Okay, so let's do finally our first camera animation. For that, I just go inside my camera again, and we will going to use the timeline here to set keyframes. So what's a keyframe? A keyframe is basically just like a saved position at a certain point in time. So let's say at frame 0, we want to save the position of that camera. We do that by hitting that key button down here. So now the position of that camera is saved at frame 0. Now I move my keyframe slider position thing right here to the 120 frame setting, and then I move my camera to that position. And then I hit the keyframe button again. Easy as that. That's how we do a camera animation. So if you play, you see that we have a smooth transition from, well, with this camera, from the platonic object to our cube. Now if I go out of the camera, you can also see that we have this animation visualization here. So we can see actually the path of the camera, and we can also see the camera object moving. So that's a good visualization of how the camera moves in space. Okay, let's have a close look here at our camera animation. If you look closely, you can see that the camera will start slow and then speed up a little bit, accelerate, and then slows down a bit. Maybe you can see that a bit more vividly here in the camera itself. So slow down, come to stop. Slow start, acceleration, and slow down a little bit. That is called an ease in and ease out, and it's sometimes actually very useful to have your camera animation like that. Now, if you want to change this kind of animation acceleration, we can go to the advanced timeline. So we go to Window and we go into the timeline dope sheet for this. Now, if you have this camera selected, and actually you can, how you navigate in that is you just use the same shortcuts as you would in your viewport. So you can move around, zoom in, zoom out a little bit to navigate here. So I just hold the number 2 down on my keyboard and scroll down with the mouse a little bit, or move my mouse a little bit to get that frame range here into view. So as you can see on the top here, we have this kind of smoothened out transition. And if I switch here to the timeline F-curve mode, actually, you can see right here in this curve that we have this kind of ease in and ease out, what we call it. Now, if I switch to linear here, you can see how this curve is flattened out. It's just like a line now. And now the animation of our camera is not slowing down at the beginning or at the end of the animation. And this is actually quite useful or good to know, that if you want to have camera animations and cut to the next camera, that we have this kind of linear interpolation between points, because otherwise it would look kind of strange if we cut to a different camera. Okay, so let me get out of that camera again, and let's say we want to do now something different. Let's say we want to add another camera, and the other camera should rotate around our object here. Now there is 2 ways to do that. So just let me illustrate you that how actually not to do it. So the first thing we want to do is say we want to zoom in on this platonic object, and I go to, let's actually do it like this. We double our frame rate here. We go to 240 frames, and what we want to do is we want to have this pan animation from our first camera until frame 120, and then from this point on later we want to have a cut to that rotating camera. So let's call the first camera we have here, that's our pan, and this will be our rotation camera. Okay, so let me get in here. So the way you could do it more or less is we add a keyframe here at frame 120, save the position of the camera, rotate it around a little bit, let's say to this side, and actually first of all you have to pick the new time in point on your timeline. So this is now frame 240, hit the key button again, and now we have this transition, and now you actually see what the problem with that is. Let me go out to see it even more clearly. You see, although I moved the camera around and rotated it, we have that rotation in the camera animation, but it's moving on that straight line from point A to point B. So we have to find another way to do that, and we will do that by using a spline. So before we do that, let me get rid of the timeline or the keyframes here, and actually there are 2 ways to do that. The first thing you can do is you can go in here shift click on those rows and lines, and then go to animation and say delete track. Now what you can also do, you can just go into your timeline here, select the keyframe, go to delete, select the other one, go to delete, and this will result in the same thing. Now because we had that animation going, we still have that animation track in here, so the more or the better way, the cleaner way to do is to say, okay, I want to delete that whole track and I'm good. Okay, so what we're going to need is we're going to need two things. First of all, we want to do it that the camera, this camera here, will stay like not focused but centered on that platonic object. So for that we use a target object. So it's a tag, so you go right click on your rotation camera, animation tags, target. So the target tag we can use to define a target so that the camera will always look at that target. And as a target we will pick the platonic object, put it in here as target object, and you see the camera did some small rotation there. I go back into the rotation camera and see we have the platonic object is right in center. Okay, good. Now if I move my camera around, you see I will always stay at this platonic object. Okay, perfect. Now the next thing we need is we need a spline or a path on which the camera should rotate on. So let's go ahead and have a look what we get here. We got the circle object. That's good for doing this kind of thing. I go to the circle object settings and we will switch the plane of that circle to X and Z so that it's flat on the ground. And I will increase the radius to quite a bit. Let's say something like 550, and then I will probably move it up a little bit. Oops, just let me grab the y-axis here. So this will be the spline, the path our camera will move along on. But there's still one thing we need to do. We need to tell the camera that it should move on that spline. So I do right click, go again to animation tags and go to Align-To-Spline. So this tag will now tell the camera, okay, please align my camera to that spline. And here again we have to say in the attributes which spline path it should use. It should use the circle spline. Let me go out of the camera to see what we have done. You see the camera is now attached to that spline. And now what we can do is we can use the position of the Align-To-Spline tag to rotate the camera around our sphere. So let's say at frame 120 we want to set a keyframe, we want to set the position. In this case we just use this, let's call it record button over here. We record that position, and then at frame 240, let's say we want to do a 180-degree shot. So full 180 degree, it would be 50%. Hit that record button again, and there we go. Let's go in the camera, see how that looks. Nice. Okay. Now, so what we want to do now is we want to have this camera movement, the pan from one object to the other, and then do this kind of cut to the other camera. You can see for now we have the pan going on from frame 0 to frame 120, and then from frame 120 to frame 240. Now, how do we do the switch from one camera to the other? For that, we have an object inside of Cinema 4D, and you find that here hidden under the floor object if you click and hold your mouse and then go to the stage object. The stage object is exactly made for this kind of thing. We can set up stages and we can set up different cameras to switch at certain points in time. So let's go back here to frame 0, and we want to put in the pan camera, which is our first camera, and we want to hit the record button for that. We want to have the pan camera active from frame 0 up to frame, let's say 119, or we can even go to 120, and at that point we want to switch to the rotation camera. So I put that in, hit the keyframe button here again, the record button, And then you can see if I switch back here 1 frame back and forth, we have that switch. So let's do playback. We have the pan, and then at frame 120 we have the switch to the other camera. Okay, now working on platonic objects and cubes isn't that much fun, so for the next episode we will use a real car model to do something more exciting. Okay, thanks guys for listening. I hope you find that helpful so far, and yeah, make sure to subscribe and the next video will be up pretty soon, promised. Bye bye.